The rain hit like needles the night Jonathan Reeves stood on the porch of the only home his daughter had ever known, holding a single trash bag of her clothes in one hand and her small trembling fingers in the other, while behind him the door slammed shut with a finality that echoed louder than thunder. He was 34 years old, a father, a husband no more, and as of that moment, officially homeless. If you believe in second chances, in quiet dignity, and in the kind of justice that shows up when you least expect it, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel, because this story is about to remind you that the lowest moment of your life can be the doorway to the greatest one. Jonathan had married into the Sinclair family 8 years earlier, back when he was a construction foreman with calloused hands and a heart too big for his own good. His wife, Danielle Sinclair, came from money, old Boston money, the kind that built hospitals and had its name etched into library walls. Her parents, Gerald and Constance Sinclair, never once let Jonathan forget that he had married up, that he was a guest in their world who had overstayed his welcome the moment their daughter grew tired of him. When Danielle filed for divorce 18 months ago, citing differences neither of them could quite name, the Sinclairs treated it not as a family tragedy but as a correction, a mistake finally being undone. The divorce had been finalized that very afternoon in a cold courtroom in Hartford, Connecticut. Jonathan had fought for shared custody and won it, but the house he'd helped Danielle's family renovate with his own 2 hands over 3 summers, was never his. It belonged to the Sinclairs, and the moment the judge's gavel came down, Constance Sinclair had looked at him the way one looks at a stain on an expensive rug. "Get your things," she'd said, her voice flat as a closed door. "Both of you. Tonight." His daughter, 6-year-old Josephine, called Josie by everyone who loved her, had asked why Grandma Constance wouldn't let them stay just one more night, since it was raining so hard outside. Jonathan hadn't had an answer that wouldn't break her heart further, so he'd simply zipped up her little yellow raincoat, tucked her stuffed rabbit under her arm, and walked her out into a storm that seemed to be crying on his behalf. They spent that first night in his old pickup truck in a church parking lot off Route 44, Josie curled against his chest, asking in a small voice if they were poor now. Jonathan told her they were rich in the ways that mattered, even as his stomach twisted with the very real fear of where they'd sleep tomorrow, and the day after that. He had $412 in his checking account. He had a daughter who trusted him completely. And he had a secret he hadn't told a single soul in the Sinclair family, not even Danielle, for 11 long years. Long before he ever swung a hammer on a Sinclair renovation crew, Jonathan Reeves had been someone else entirely. At 22, fresh out of a small state college in Vermont, he built a piece of software with his college roommate Marcus Ellery, a simple inventory tracking tool for small hardware stores that, almost by accident, became the backbone system used by thousands of independent retailers across the country. Jonathan had sold his stake quietly at 26 for an amount that would have stunned anyone who knew him only as the quiet, humble man who mixed concrete for a living. He had never touched most of that money. He built a mansion with it in the hills outside Litchfield, Connecticut, 40 minutes from the very house he'd just been thrown out of, a $30 million estate he had never lived in, never furnished beyond the essentials, and never told his wife or her parents existed. Why keep it hidden? Because Jonathan had grown up poor in a trailer outside Burlington, watching his own father chase after women who only wanted his lottery winnings until there was nothing left to chase. He had promised himself that if he ever loved someone, they would love him, not his money. And so when he met Danielle at a hardware convention, young and unassuming in his work boots, he let her fall for the man, not the fortune. He kept the mansion as a secret sanctuary, a place he visited twice a year simply to remind himself it was real, and otherwise lived modestly, working alongside the very contractors he could have bought out 100 times over, because he wanted his daughter to grow up knowing the value of $1 and the dignity of hard work. But sitting in that truck at midnight, watching his little girl shiver despite the heater running full blast, Jonathan realized that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Some promises are meant to be broken when your child's safety is on the line. The next morning, as pale October sunlight broke over the Litchfield hills, Jonathan drove through a set of wrought iron gates he hadn't opened in nearly 2 years. Josie pressed her face to the truck window as the driveway wound past a small lake, a stable, and gardens gone slightly wild from neglect, before the house itself came into view, a limestone estate with 31 rooms, an indoor pool, and a library with a ceiling painted like the night sky. "Daddy, is this a castle?" Josie whispered, and for the first time in 18 hours, Jonathan laughed, a real laugh, cracked and exhausted but real, as he told her that yes, in a way, it was theirs. He called his old business partner Marcus that morning, and within a week a small staff was quietly restoring the estate to life, not for show, but so his daughter could have a warm bed, a working kitchen, and a backyard to run in. Jonathan enrolled Josie in the local elementary school under their own name, drove her himself in the same worn pickup truck out of habit, and told no one at the school gates what lay behind those iron gates. He wasn't interested in being known as a rich man. He was interested in being known as a good father. Word travels fast in small Connecticut towns, though, and it wasn't long before whispers reached Danielle, and then Gerald and Constance Sinclair, that the man they tossed out into a storm like garbage was in fact one of the quietest, wealthiest men in the county. Constance showed up at the gates herself one gray November afternoon, her pride swallowed just enough to ask, through the intercom, if perhaps they could talk, if perhaps there was a way to make amends now that things had, in her words, changed. Jonathan stood in his study window, watching her car idle at the end of his long driveway, and felt not triumph, but a quiet, aching sadness, because he understood in that moment that nothing about him had changed at all. Only her perception of his worth had changed, and that told him everything he needed to know about the family he'd spent 8 years trying to belong to. He didn't let her in that day. Instead, he wrote her a short letter thanking her, without a trace of sarcasm, for teaching him the most important lesson of his life, that character reveals itself not in comfort, but in how people treat you when they believe you have nothing left to give. He told her Josie was welcome to see her grandparents anytime, because a child's love for her family shouldn't be a casualty of adult pride, but that he himself needed no seat at their table any longer, because he had built one of his own, wide enough for anyone who had ever shown him true kindness. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it made you think of your own second chances, your own quiet strength, or the family you built when the one you were given let you down, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below, because your words genuinely help this story reach the people who need to hear it most. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something simple. In the comments, tell me one word that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. I read every single one. 6 months later, Jonathan stood in the doorway of Josie's new bedroom, painted the exact shade of lavender she'd asked for, watching her spin in circles across a floor that was finally, truly hers, and he thought about that rainy porch, that trash bag, that trembling hand in his. He thought about how the lowest night of his life had led him home, not to a mansion, but to the version of himself he'd always been underneath the calluses and the quiet. Some families are given to us. Others we build brick by brick, out of love, patience, and the refusal to let one storm define an entire life. And as Josie ran into his arms laughing, Jonathan Reeves finally understood that he had never once, in all his life, been truly poor.